Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה. וערב נא אדוני אלוהינו דברי תורתך בפינו ופיך בית ישראל, ונהיה אנחנו וצאצאינו וצאצאיך בית ישראל. כולנו יודע שמך ולומדי תורתך לשמה, ברוך אתה אדוני מלמד תורה לעמו ישראל.
אמן.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בך בנו מכל עמים, ונתן לנו תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, so let me just hit the Mishnah Brura, and then we'll cut this off and go straight into the next thing. Okay. All right, so this is by Rabbi Daniel Brody, Rabbi Gary Brody's brother. And the title of this year is when your wife says, oops, I forgot to bring up that. So don't worry, it's nothing inappropriate. What it actually means is that maybe this part has to be edited out. Sorry, my last comment. But what it actually means is that we were talking about a hefsek. What's considered the beginning and end of a meal? And what we said originally is that there's two factors. Number one, thought, machshava, intent, and the other one is action. So, for example, if somebody is at your table and there are a lot of guests and they're kind of overstaying your welcome and they think it's a Chabad meal and you actually want to have a Shabbos afternoon shlof and you yawn quite loudly, and especially even on a Friday night when your lights go off and they're still there and they haven't gotten the hint, you start with Shira Malot and that'll be the end of the meal. So that signifies that it's the end. We also said issues like Mayim Achroidim, etc., etc. So other things are conceptual. So for example, a visitor only ends the meal when the host has officially declared it's time to bench or does Mayim Achroidim. And the visitor approves. Well, look, if the visitor doesn't take the hint, you're going to have a stronger hint. In other words, a visitor's meal is not over, even if he himself has made a decision to stop, unless the host has said or done something to end it. So, in other words, especially if you have a mezuzah and more than 3 males, it would have to be almost a group decision. In such a case, the usual rules of restarting apply. So in other words, number one, at the point where there's a declaration by the host to say that, the meal's come to an end, share a malot, and start singing smerot, etc., the guest should not eat anything, obviously at the point where you finish dessert. But if you do not make a before brocha or a before drinking brocha, because you often said that if you do have cold drink or something during a meal, you certainly don't need to do a share cord. It's only if you're obviously having borei priya gafen, because it's considered having it with the meal. And you can't have hard liquor without doing an individual brocha, because unless you're Irish, having heavy liquor with the meal is not average, by the way. So I suppose if you come from Ladino culture, Sephardi culture, having wine with a meal would constitute a normal event of a meal. Red wines with meat and white wines with fish and chicken. We're adding a bit of culture to the shir. Figured why not? But I think then you'd have to do a borei priya gafen, just as a matter of interest. Gav, I'm still seeing your ceiling.
Sorry.
It's okay. You know what? I'm getting so affectionately fond of that ceiling. Every day we see the ceiling.
I did some repairs to the ceiling. I wanted to show it off.
Thank you. So just one issue quickly. So in other words, you don't restart. You just carry on eating. So there's no hefsek. But if the host hasn't ended the meal or the visitor wants to continue eating or drinking, the visitor may do so without making any brochas. Like when we say brocha rishona, like for example, it would be hamotzi or borei pri adamai, etc. In dessert, with regard to borei priya 8, that's a separate case which we'll deal with. And the reason why you don't make as a guest one of the initial brochas is you don't want to mislead the other guests with the action. Just 1 or 2 last points and then we're done. Now, there's a statement that if there's a big person around, when we say a big person around, we don't mean a 300-pound person that enjoys eating. We mean a big person like a choshev person. So if he's known as the Rov or the Gadol and he says, listen, we should bench, or it's a Rosh Hashiva, generally the host will acquiesce to that person, and therefore that person can also declare it's the end of a meal. Okay? And according to the title of this year, when your wife says, oops, I forgot to bring out what it means is that since usually the poskim rule that since one's wife is usually in charge of the food, she's considered the host of the meal, not the husband. She's the one that actually does all the schlepping. So unless she says that there's no other courses to bring out that decisively conveys it, either to the guest or husband, etc., the meal isn't finished. And you definitely want to listen to her because you don't want machloikas between the husband and wife afterwards. So if the husband or child says, let's bench, I'm done, etc., and the mother of the wife of the house says, but I still got ice cream and tea, they may continue drinking it without the brachas. The visitor should do it out of deference to the hostess, and the husband should do it if he wants a good marriage. Okay, so on that share we'll end. We've reached 179 in both the Mishnah Berurah and the Kitzur Shul. We already discussed with monetary assessment, and you know exactly that both parties, if they damage each other, it gets worked out to a T, and everything is calculated exactly. I gave you the historical reasons for this. Then yesterday we went through a brief explanation of the rabbis that taught in a brisa. When the Mishnah says that payment's something worth money, it teaches that the court does not involve itself with anything but real property. So the first thing that what we discussed is it seemed to be a contradiction which Gavin picked up upon, which I was hinting towards, but you didn't even need much hinting with Gavin because he was on the ball yesterday. And he basically said, well, I don't understand, because it implies that we learned that you can collect from anything. You can collect from brand, something worth money, cash, etc. And what I did is I sent you four guys the audios from my conversation with Rabbi Ran Cohen, because immediately when I read it, it seemed a contradiction to what we learned in the previous stuff. So a couple of good points that it's talking about here is that Rabbi Cohen quite expressly mentioned that there's a difference between when you're not looking for trouble and somebody damages your property. I mean, you get desperate. At the end of the day, you want your article fixed. So you'll take whatever they're going to give you. I mean, the first choice of it is if they have property, the court gives you choice property, because you can convert A-grade property to cash very, very quickly. But sometimes a guy that damages you doesn't have two pots and a window to throw it out of. So in other words, when you're dealing with that sort of person, they don't have a lot of money to give you. So you're kind of in a situation where you turn around and say, well, whatever you got, I just need to convert it to cash to fix my damage. But that's not when you're looking for problems. That's when somebody damages you. Generally, it's going to be okay. I'll tell you why. Because think of how damage occurs. We're living now in a city where people of different economic brackets can damage you without insurance. Minibus taxi knocks you out. He doesn't have insurance. You're not going to exactly claim from him. He's going to have a knopkiri in his minibus, and that's the end of the conversation. But in most agrarian cultures, what happened is who would damage you? Either you'd be in the public domain where you would be exempt for shane and regal, which is the normal way that the animal moves, etc., with regal, and shane where the animal got gratification within the public area. But where both people can bring their animals, it's fine. If you had a stall in the public domain where it's a private store that owe you, etc., you'd have a court system. But it would be a very, very small community, even when it was referred to as a city. Okay? Now, we're living in a city of huge populations of people of different economic brackets. When you had a damager, most cases of damage would be when your neighbor's animal came into your property to damage. So if you could afford a certain level of property, so could your neighbor. So to extract a field from your neighbor was a hell of a lot easier in an agrarian culture. Why? Because he had land. So certain things obviously have changed and evolved over time. But the point of it is damage was not a problem you looked for. So eventually the Gemara turned around and said, look, there are choices, but eventually you can't squeeze the blood out of a stone. And the court is going to say, well, what have you got to convert it to cash easily. Now, it doesn't mean that you pay the guy a shortfall, because he still has to recover that sort of cash. But the obligation is now on the damaged party to sell that item to recover his cash, recoup his cash. It's not on the damager. So that, because the damager is also paying, but the damaged party also has to exert himself. So it kind of mitigates the effort amongst both parties. Okay? That's very, very straightforward. But when somebody damages you, at that point, you're very happy to just get payment. When you're providing somebody with a loan, if you don't do your due diligence, you're a fool. You have to have a certain amount of caution. It says help your brother, but not to your degree of impoverishment. So you have to have liens on property or on that grade of land, even according to the other argument where it's on grade of land and not on that property. And in that particular case, there's a lien attached to either that property or that grade of land upon which the court can collect. Guys, are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking mainly in the case of a creditor in this particular context, not in the case of a damager. So that's what Rabbi Cohen was mentioning. Also, the fact of it is that you've got to bear in mind is that it. What I thought of last night is when it changed to collection from movables is when the society changed from an agrarian agricultural society to a case where people moved to cities. You had the Industrial Revolution, but even way before that, during the Middle Ages, societies did change where instead of doing farming of agriculture, you had animals. Then there were skills that developed. Then there were everybody from scribes to translators to blacksmiths, creating weaponry. So there wasn't just farming that took place. Things changed. You also had pogroms in areas where the hostile nations didn't allow us to, with peace, especially when we were exiled out of Jerusalem and the temple, to have property or our own land. So then obviously you couldn't attach to land, because land wasn't the predominant form of ownership with each and every person. Those that were in agriculture, fine, but most people were living in a small hovel and making their money in another method. So at that point in Talmudic history, well, past Talmudic and more with the Rishonim, etc., you're dealing with the society that made their livings from everything from usury to financial sophisticated methodologies, etc. And when the financial system got more advanced, as well as the fact that we went from an agrarian society to more of a city or suburban sort of living within our ghettos, etc., and we're talking even in the Middle Ages, where you had the Rishonim like Rashi, etc., it was attaching to movables by the court, by the Beis Din. So that did change. Also, your methods of collection were more sophisticated. In other words, we even saw with the Gemara that we studied that in the first place, we're talking about a case of how do you extract back from the buyer? How does a creditor get back from the buyer when the debtor sold the property to the buyer? And then it got more sophisticated where there was this case of a guarantee. And even if it wasn't stipulated in the contract, the default position that it was seen as a scribal omission. And even though it was a scribal omission, unless it said the word no guarantee, there was a guarantee. So every time you had drama, you had the law system that would catch up with the behavior of the people. Does that make sense? So these methods became more sophisticated. One of the things that Rabbi Cohen said to me is there started to become public announcements when you're selling your property. And we even see this in law, in certain businesses that go into liquidation. I don't know if you remember in the old days, I mean, we're now in an internet phase. You'd see it in the Northeastern Tribune or in the Star, etc. There had to be a certain amount of distribution. I don't think it was allowed in the Northeastern Tribune. I think it had to be a national-based paper or city-based paper, not a suburban-based paper, where if you were selling one business to another party or there was a case of an insolvency, that you'd have to publish it. Are you with me? And there was a deed office and various government mechanisms to record these sort of liens on property so that the buyer, obviously let the buyer beware. And then you had mortgages and banks and third parties that would take care of these issues. So it became quite sophisticated. So these are just some of the issues I wanted to bring up. There was a chidush that Hashem gave me to deal with this particular case when it says if a damaged party that the court does not involve itself with anything but real property. We obviously discussed one of the reasons for real property yesterday was the fact that you couldn't hide real property, it wouldn't break down, you couldn't have somebody playing any sort of shenanigans where they put it in the third party's name. Property doesn't move. It's the safest way to deal with it. People could only have a shtar, a contract, or a financial record of transaction, but the land doesn't move anyway. It's the safest way to give a loan, is to have a lien on a property. So that for sure is there. And I want to show you one or two proofs, and I'm going to do a share screen now. Guys, I hope I've explained this in a clear manner. I'm doing my best.
Yeah, you're doing a good job, Dan.
Okay, so just give me 1 second, gentlemen. Okay. Okay, 1 sec. Just hang on, I just want to see. Okay, here it is. Okay, now what you can see, guys, on the screen here is, I don't know if you can see, but I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pages on the daf on different parts of Shas to prove my case on everything. Okay? And the reason why I wanted to do it was because I wanted you never to take my word for it, but to always get evidence on everything, if that makes sense. So obviously this is the Mishnah that we're dealing with. The determination of payment of damages is made by monetary appraisal. We dealt with that. One pays with items worth money. We're going to come and see how this means property. But what I wanted to show you is in Kedushin 26a. What does it state? Property that serves as a guarantee. Because land is fixed in the earth. Okay? And property that does not serve as a guarantee is movable property. Does that make sense in terms of evidence of what I'm saying? Fine.
Yes.
There is a chiddush I wanted to tell you that I remember learning in 7a. Rabbi Cohen didn't give me this. Don't worry, he gives me help with a lot of things. And but this particular gift was from Hashem. Is that, remember where we stated, why is the court involved with things as per Gavin's question, just with choice, just with property and not with movables when you can pay with brand or anything. Do you remember we learned this in 7a where Rava resolves the contradiction? He says, he shall recompense is referring to a case where the damager or the pays of his own volition without being taken to court and therefore may use any form of payment.
Okay.
Yeah, very clever. Well done. Well done for finding this. Yeah.
Well, Hashem gave it to me. I'm a retard, but Hashem.
Yeah, no, I remember this now. I remember this.
It just dawned on me last night.
Yeah, this is the exact explanation we needed. Thank you.
Sure. So the fact of it is, the phrase "the best of his field" is referring to a case where he pays against his will, after the injured party had sued him in court. Because I wanted to find a reason why we said with the creditor why you'd have a lien on a property, but what's the case of the damager? In what case would he not end up in court? And it's when he pays out of his own volition and doesn't trouble the court. So that's the evidence that I wanted to share with you guys in terms of...
Yeah, that was good. That was very good.
Very good. Yeah, solid.
Okay, cool. Now, am I still sharing my screen or not?
No.
No, now you're sharing us.
Okay. All right. I'm still learning to use the software. All right. Now, I need to go through something else. However, if the damaged party went first and seized movables, the court will collect for him from them. So let me just repeat the statement. So the first thing we said is the court does not involve itself with anything but real property. However, if the damaged party went first and seized movables from the damager, the court will collect for him from them. What do you think it means, guys?
Maybe the guy hasn't got land.
Well, Michael, that's exactly the answer. In a case where the guy hasn't got land, if not you, I don't want to use the word you is in bringing something negative upon yourself. Let's call him Ruvain. If Ruvain doesn't trust that Shimon will pay him for damages because he's going to get rid of his movable property, the first thing Ruvain does is quickly goes and attaches the assets. But there cannot be anarchy. So what he has to do is immediately attach them, lock them up, and Reuven now Shimon obviously wants to hurt Reuven now. Why? Because Shimon says, you stole my property, and says, no, you damaged me. So the first thing that Reuven should do is go to the Beis Din and say, guys, I've confiscated the goods. Reuven, my name's Reuven. Shimon's not happy. He wants to tonk me now. And I want this to come to the Beis Din. I want you guys to sort it out. I'm prepared to hand it over to the court so that it can be appraised fairly. Does that make sense? So that the court handles it. Because if it's now just between Shimon and Reuven, we're back to anarchy. So that can't occur. So exactly as Michael says, that the damaged party is worried that he's not going to get paid. But he cannot take the law into his own hands. So the minute he confiscates it, if he's worried that he's not going to get paid, he has to notify the court immediately and say, this is what I took, here's the inventory, you sort it out. I just want my money. You can return everything. Make sense? It's pretty straightforward. We're going to learn that it has a different implication in terms of orphans and heirs, etc., which we're going to deal with. But Michael's point is spot on the mark. So, Michael, welcome back. This is why we need you. Okay, good.
I just answer first. I'm sure the other guys.
Well, you know what? It's known as the quickest gun in the West. This is the problem or the benefit of the Gemara Shir. So if a person isn't awake, they don't look. There's no second place in a race. I'm sorry. In other words, whoever answers first is the one that
Be brighter than the rest.
It's the fastest gun in the West. The last one to draw the pistol gets shot. Okay. But, all right, so let's just go on. So the thing that we're asking here is the next question. When the Mishnah states that payment is made with something worth money, how does it mean real estate? In other words, how does the Brisa see the phrase worth money, any reference to real estate in particular? I mean, in other words, I'm saying something worth money. How come I can't see it as any other item of value? Why am I more inclined to see it readily as real estate?
Because it's fixed. Can't move.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Fine. So that's the one answer, that it's fixed and that it's not going to move anywhere and you're guaranteed to get your money. So then Rabbi Bar Ula has got a different statement. And he says it means something worth any amount of money that one pays for it. So Rabbi Bar Ula uses the statement, something worth any amount of money that one pays for it. Now, it's confusing because initially when you're saying any amount of money one pays for it, but you buy other things. But now he's talking about a different case. So the Gemara comes to explain, Rabbi Bar Ula said, means something that is worth any amount of money that one pays for it. And this is 14b2. The Gemara questions this explanation. In what sense is it true that real estate is worth any amount of money? It's in the sense that it's not something that's subject to the laws of price fraud. Okay, so I need to fill you in on a little bit of detail here. Okay. Now, if I'm selling, if Reuven is selling goods to Shimon, and Shimon sells him and makes a markup on those goods, there's a certain market value for that item. Okay? And say that market value of that item is worth 100 zuz. Does that make sense? And then basically, he sells it for 115 zuz. Let's just say Reuven sells it to Shimon. He has to, if it's a sixth more than the normal retail price compared to the to other people, and he's unfairly charged more than the sixth of a market-related rate. And what we see is, what is a market-related rate? Is an aggregate. So there were certain items in those days that had a set price, and in fact, we see the government gets involved now in maize and food products like bread that the poor people can afford, and the price is fixed to be affordable, and there's a certain average. You know, if you buy brown bread, it's an average of 12 Rand a loaf. If you buy white bread, it's an average of 15 Rand a loaf. So you can now sell a brown bread for about 20 Rand a loaf, because that's considered price fraud. Guys, you with me? So if you charge more than, if you charge exactly a sixth or less more than the average price, and what they take is, if there's a variant of price, you take the mean aggregate average. If it's more than a sixth, you have to refund that. Right. But the deal still counts. You just have to refund the portion that you took advantage of. But in a case where it's more than a sixth that you overcharged, the deal is null and void. The buyer can get out of the deal.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Are you talking about the charge that Reuben is selling to Shimon? Or
yeah, let's just use the term.
You're not talking about the end user now. You're talking about just between the two of them. Sorry.
Okay, it's a good question. Mark was asking, what happens if there's a retail chain and wholesalers, etc. Let's just take a classic case of buyer and seller. Okay, you have somebody that's selling an item that has a fixed value. Let's just choose an item for this theory's sake in the cleanest way. It has a fixed value, and this person is charging more than a sixth of what the price should be. Okay? If it's more than a sixth, the deal is null and void and the buyer can get out of it. Fine. If it's a sixth or under, he has to refund the difference between the fair market related price and that 1/6 or under back to the buyer. The seller has to refund.
Okay.
In other words, if he's ripping the guy off completely, fine, and it's more than a sixth, deal's null and void. The buyer can get out of it. If it's less than a sixth or up to a sixth, he has to just refund in the portion that he overcharged. Fine. That's very, very straightforward. This is a case of price fraud, and this is known as ona'ah, okay? And this is in Bava Kamma 56a, and I'm going to share my screen because, as I said to you, everything that I do here is going to be based on evidence. Okay. Okay, let me just see if yeah. Read this, Michael.
Okay. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? It is as the sages taught. It is written, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquired from the colleague's hand, one shall not exploit his brother. This is referring to an item acquired from hand to hand. Land is excluded as it is not movable. Slaves are excluded as they are juxtaposed to land in several sources, and therefore the legal status is like that of land in certain respects. Documents are excluded as it is written. So 1 second. As it is written, and if you sell your colleague an item that is sold, so let's scroll down here.
I'll scroll down, yeah.
Documents are excluded as it is written, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold, indicating an item that is itself sold and itself acquired. Sorry, let me just read that again. Documents are excluded as it is written. And If you sell to your colleague an item that is sold, indicating an item that is itself sold and itself acquired, documents are excluded as they are not sold themselves and they're not acquired themselves. They have no intrinsic value as they exist only for proof therein.
Okay, so let me explain this in simple Damon language. Well read, Michael. That makes absolute sense to me. So I'm going to just hang on a sec. Okay, this is a little bit easier to read now because I've got all the matters here. So what it's saying is, this is exactly what it's saying in the Gemara, is that basically Rabbi Bar Ula said it means something that is worth any amount of money that one pays for it, meaning basically any movable that we learned, any movable is subject to price fraud, the laws of price fraud, meaning that if you charge up to 1/6, you refund the balance of 1/6. If it's more than 1/6, the deal is null and void. But this is not true of property, because if we're learning here on Bava Kamma 56b, it says, from where these matters derived, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 14, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquired from your colleague's hand, one shall not exploit his brother. This is referring to an item acquired from hand to hand. What is hand to hand? Movables. Land is excluded as it's not movable. Slaves are excluded as they juxtapose to land in several sources. We had that discussion, are slaves considered movable or are they considered land? And because they're considered land in many of the sources, halachically, as well as biblically, as we saw, in that case, they're seen like land in halacha. So, in other words, price fraud mainly has to do with movables, from what we can see in the source in Bava Kamma 56b. Does that make sense? So that's what Rabbi Bar Ula is coming to say, is that we're only talking about here that when we say that something is worth any amount of money, meaning you can sell it for much more than the market-related price. And it's not subject to price fraud, where in order for there to be price fraud, there has to be a fixed value on that item. Am I correct, guys? In order to use to say I'm selling it at an unfair price, there has to be a deemed price of what's considered fair, yes or no?
Yes, otherwise there's no means.
Yes, otherwise you need a context, an anchor point of saying more than this it's unfair. But land is not subject to price fraud, meaning, and I'll give you a perfect proof for this. Do you remember we learned about the rates of Tishrei and Nisan, where in Nisan the price was worth double that of Tishrei for land value?
Yes.
So therefore, that's the proof. That's the very proof that land is not subject to price fraud, because the fluctuation can almost double.
Wasn't there a limitation that you couldn't go above double?
Yes, so we're going to hit that now. But the point of it is, there is a commentary regarding that. Okay? So Tosfot explains that real estate can be subject to the law of price fraud, but at a much higher level, which is double the market price. Excellent, Gavin. I know you did your work. Now I know you did your work.
James, sorry, maybe I'm thinking too much of a modern context, but why can't movables be considered to have a market-related value?
No, we're saying exactly that they do have a market-related value. Movables.
Movables. Why can't they also have a market-related, like a market-related value?
Although land does, people will pay for it what they perceive it to be worth. Let me give you a perfect example. In Glen Hazel is not a fancy place, but everybody wants to live near the shore. Okay? If you have a look at Sandton, it's not really fancy, it's a piece of land. Everybody wants to live in Morningside or Sandton or Glen Hazel. So because of the perceived desire for it, or like a Porsche even, it's got, people are prepared to pay more. It's not a fixed price, for example, where it's considered a staple food, where you're affecting the poor, or it has to have a certain laws of fair play. If somebody wants to pay 8 million rand for a place in Sunny Road, for a house, call a kavod to them. Good luck. If they want to do something that's stupid, fine. You know, I mean, you go down the road in Sydenham and you're paying a half. It's their choice. And that's what we say. Especially in an agrarian society where in certain seasons where you were planting, the property value would double. You can't have a case of price fraud because of the vast nature of the property escalation and de-escalation according to when the agriculture was due to be harvested. So that's all I'm saying.
But I'm saying even commodities have a certain price.
But that's what we're saying, Michael. We're agreeing with you. Anything movable has a certain price. But there are things that are legally have a issue of price fraud and other ones that don't. In the Consumer Act, okay, I've got a book on the Consumer Act that if you ripped off, you've got a certain day cooling off period. You have got certain mechanisms to deal with fair business practice, especially as a consumer, as opposed to business. Do you get what I'm saying? And most of those are movable items. No. You know, today we're living in a society where you get publications and you know what every 55-inch TV costs. But I'm saying price fraud, from a Talmudic point of view, mainly occurred with movables because they were far more easy to equate, whereas land would depend on, are you closer to Yerushalayim? Is the quality of the land better? And people could choose to buy or not buy that land, depending on whether the harvest was due. So all Gavin was saying is that, according to Tosfot, there is a case where there is a level of price fraud with land. He's correct, same as what you're implying to say, perhaps also with property, but it's at a much higher level. It's at double the market price. Whereas it's because the item is worth less on a movable, it's much more sensitive to up to 1/6 that you have to refund if it's greater. Does that make sense? So if you overpaid for the acquisition and the charge was more than 1/6, deal null and void. If it was up to 1/6, you refund the balance. That's according to Rashi. Mark, are you still not sure?
No, I'm fine. I said hundreds.
No. I'm here to answer any question. Tell me if you're not sure of anything. Okay. All right. So what he's saying is, this is what it means, is that it's talking about property because something that you pay anything for, literally, meaning it's not a fixed price. Therefore, if there's no fixed price, it's not subject to the laws of price fraud. So therefore, Rabbi Ba'ula suggests that we're actually talking here about property, about real estate. Does that make sense? And then basically the Gemara has an objection. What's that objection? Slaves and legal documents are also not subject to the laws of price fraud. Why? Because as far as slaves are concerned, they're deemed as property. And how do we know that? By the screen that we're sharing. And you can see my screen where it says, slaves are excluded like land as they juxtaposed to land in several sources. So the objection that the Gemara wants to have to Rabbi Bar-Ula is you can't be talking just of land. Why? Because slaves are also not subject to the laws of price fraud. Fine. Because it's seen as land, and documents also. Why? Because documents have no intrinsic value and they exist only for the proof they're in, to show who owns an article. So they're not sold themselves, they are not acquired themselves. So that the Gemara is trying to have a retaliation or contradiction to Rabbi Bar-Ula and saying we can't just be talking about land here. Your proof isn't a proof, because slaves are excluded as well as documentation from the laws of price fraud, not just land. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, Rabbi Bar Ula is saying that it's coming here to talk about land because it's not subject to the laws of price fraud because there's no fixed price. And what the Gemara is saying is that's not true. If you take a case of slaves, they're also excluded from the laws of price fraud because they're seen as land, but yet slaves are also considered movables in certain cases, in many halachic places, and a document is immovable. I can hand it to you. But because it can go hand to hand, look here, acquired from one's colleague hand to another hand. This is referring to an item acquired from hand to hand, and that means it's immovable. It's a movable item, not immovable. Sorry, guys. All right, so does that make sense? All right, guys, we're going to end off on this note. I hope it's been handy. I hope I've made it clear.
Yeah,
Cool.
perfect.
It's been
Thank you.
good. It's been great, James.